Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and I am so delighted to welcome back Kate Hubert. Hello, Kate.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's as always irresistible when I see talks that you're giving or anything you've written. And in this case, it is an upcoming talk that you're giving for the Astrological Lodge of London, called The Death Axis, Intergenerational Trauma, and the Mars Saturn Midpoint. Now, this is going to go out on Zoom on the 14th of October at 7:15 p.m. Great. Well, it won't be Greenwich Mean Time. Yes, it will be Greenwich Mean Time in October. So yes, and for those who are abroad, that's London time. So this, there's so much in that title, and I think the first bit to unpick is the notion of intergenerational trauma. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, my interest began when I was putting together the last book, The Body of Stars, and looking at pathology in the body as being kind of emblematic of evolutionary developments that were seeking to be made through a lifetime. I just felt that pathologies often capture key challenges that are represented in the birth chart. For example, if there's a kind of tough T-square, very often that describes not only the challenges in the personal life, but challenges in the life of the body's health. And I found this quite interesting because of how I started reflecting on patterns in my own birth chart and then looking at other people in my family and other generations in my family, and I kept seeing the same signatures, and I kept seeing the same degrees of the zodiac lighting up. So there was this patterning, even with people marrying into the family, they were bringing the same resonance. And the sense that I came away from having written The Body of Stars with was the body is a resonance instrument, and it works through resonance. And we understand as astrologers that the birth chart is describing a vibrational field, a resonance structure. And we attract into our lives things that resonate with us. And so it is with through the generations of our family and people marrying into our families and associating with our families, people that we have any kinds of relationship with, we will be triggering each other's resonance fields. So I started thinking of the individual field of resonance being nested in a personal ancestral field of resonance, and that in itself being nested inside a wider field of resonance that we could call collective. So I was seeing these kind of three fields that are just part of the one field, but there's an individual element, a familial ancestral element, and then the whole collective element, and they're all interacting in what we might call the field of being. And I started getting interested in trauma as a way of looking at how certain challenging patterns travel through the generations of one person's life. And while I was thinking about this, a client came along and she was describing a particular very challenging allergic reaction that she started experiencing when she got married. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. It'll be interesting to see what's going on with her seventh house. And Aries ruled the seventh house. And Mars was conjunct Uranus, very closely conjunct Uranus, in the 9th house. So there was this Mars Uranus thing, and I felt like this person wants to be independent. This person is kind of primed for autonomy, primed for freedom, hates the feeling of having her wings clipped, probably instinctively doesn't like taking someone else's name. And although she's very adoring of her husband, there was this feeling of quite an unconscious, I think, response from the body of this is compromising. And in the course of our consultation, she started sharing with me a story about her son, who died in a tragic accident when he was 22. He was struck by an electrical cable which fell down during a street festival in Ibiza. And I thought, that's interesting, because this woman has Mars Uranus, which seems to describe her allergic reaction. And now she's describing an electrical accident, which I would see the signature being Mars Uranus. And so I started looking at her chart, his chart, the interactions of Mars Uranus. I looked at the Mars Uranus midpoint. I looked at it through the generation above my client. So I had 3 generations of the Mars Uranus midpoint. And I was kind of flicking through Ebertein's book, the combination of stellar influences, thinking about midpoints. And I noted him referring to the Mars Saturn midpoint as the death axis. And I said, well, let's just see how this plays out in this case, since we have this really tragic and strange death that has occurred. And the results were absolutely phenomenal. The mother and the son shared the same Mars Saturn midpoint. They shared, I won't go into detail, but they shared lots of interactions between their midpoints, or between planets aspecting that midpoint, particularly Uranus and Chiron. The way that the transiting Mars Saturn midpoint interacted with the charts at the time of the death was extraordinary, and how the progress chart picked up the same degrees. I think the progress moon was exactly on the Mars Saturn midpoint of both of them at the time of death. It was extraordinary. Even the solar return chart made a reference to the Mars Saturn midpoint. So that's the genesis of this this talk.
Well, no wonder you wanted to explore that further. For people who are not very familiar with midpoints, can you explain what they are?
Yes, so for example, the Mars Saturn midpoint, you just take the longitude of Mars and you add it to the longitude of Saturn and you divide it by 2. So you find the place where they meet in the chart, the degree that those influences meet. And I would see this as a sort of crucible for those energies coming together and sensitizing a degree of the zodiac. And there's also the far midpoint that you can consider as well, plus some other midpoints, but let's just keep it simple and talk about the near and far midpoint. So the place between those planets and its opposite point. Have I made that clear?
Yes. Some people may be unfamiliar with longitude as well. So can you explain that a little bit more?
So there are 360 degrees in the chart. If your Mars is on 6 degrees of Aries, that we start at 0 degrees of Aries to count around the 360 degrees. So your Mars would be 6. And if your Saturn was on 6 degrees of Gemini, we would call that 66. Because it's the 66th degree of the zodiac. We'd add those two together, divide them by 2, and find the midpoint on 6 degrees of Taurus.
Good.
Or 36, the 36th degree of the zodiac. So longitude is just letting each degree of the zodiac stand for itself.
Good. That's a nice, clear explanation for everyone. So for those who are new to this, they can have some fun calculating. And when you talk about the far point, can you clarify for everyone what that is?
Yeah, that's the point opposite their nearest point of meeting. So in the example that I've just given, if Mars is on 6 degrees of Aries and Saturn is on 6 degrees of Gemini, the midpoint will be 6 degrees of Taurus, and the far midpoint will be right over the other side of the zodiac from there, 6 degrees of Scorpio.
Good. That way everyone knows exactly what you mean. So having had that clarification, I think for me listening to you, and for many people who look at their families' charts, everyone knows that there are overlaps. And what you said that really stood out for me was the concept of the body itself being a resonance field. It makes me think of the work of Rupert Sheldrake as well. And so this is an idea that we are energy bodies, and the physical body now is a resonance instrument. That's quite a concept to embrace, isn't it? Because it's almost like what we are is both transmitters and receivers.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
I suppose a way of seeing it is the birth chart describes a field of vibration that is in a particular constellation at the time of birth. And it's almost like our birth, the fact of our birth kind of encapsulates a particular constellation of vibrational influences, almost like making a tincture that we encapsulate and embody this set of vibrations, and that is the medicine that we are bringing into the collective, and that we are imbibing, and that others imbibe through us. That is our resonance field, and it denotes how energies come into our beings and leave our beings. So we're both transmitting this particular signature, and we're picking up the same particular signature from the outside. And the purpose of it all is that we are contributing to the evolution of the wider field, and the wider field being what I've already described as the ancestral field we're born into, of our known and unknown ancestors, and then the wider field around that, which is what we could call the collective.
So many people are used to thinking about charts as having the let's say the higher manifestation of the energy. and the shadow, which would be the lower manifestation of the energy. And we're, somewhere in between. Sometimes we're a bit higher, sometimes we're a bit lower in terms of the emotions that we are experiencing, which could be translated as a higher or lower vibration or a higher or lower frequency. We're talking about Mars Saturn midpoints, and as being a very sensitive signature of family karma, let's put it like that. What do you feel we need or can do to raise that frequency, which we could also say to heal the trauma, so that we're vibrating at our optimum rather than falling into despair, which would then bring in the shadow side of the chart?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because I think there's not simply positive and negative, there's a whole range of registers through which any planetary energy can manifest. And obviously, the higher the frequency, the higher the vibration, the better the flow of energy and the more positive the outcome, or the more easy the outcome. But negativity certainly has its place, because it makes life difficult for us, and that makes us awaken to our natures and to what needs to be done. So difficulty is very useful for human beings, whilst ease is not particularly productive of growth. So challenge is seen as a positive thing in this model. But yes, it's a spur to raising the vibration. How can we do that? I think that's a lot about understanding the energies that seek to manifest through us. And I think this is where astrology is unrivaled as a therapeutic tool, because it codifies the ways in which energies move through the realm of Earth. And when we can understand what energies are trying to achieve, what they may optimally achieve, we can begin to identify what that might look like in our lives. So, for example, let's look at Mars. At the negative level, Mars is a thug. There's no two ways about it. It's aggression, violence, the will to survive at whatever cost. That's the basic primal message of Mars, is I will survive. So how can we, at a more civilized and productive level, use that energy? I see it almost like having a sword and shield. When you're born, you're given a sword and shield, something to defend yourself with and something to attack with. If you don't know what you're doing in your life, you will hurt other people or yourself with your sword, and you will be defensive in situations you don't need to be defensive in, because you don't know what you're about. So when we can identify what we truly want, then we can use the sword of truth with its keen edge to cut through the nonsense, to identify that. And we can use our shield to create good boundaries so that we can move towards what we want. And I think this is no simple thing. I mean, it sounds like I'm being glib. This is not a simple thing to identify what we want. In fact, it's the hardest and most recurring question of our lives. And it's an art to know truly what we want. But it's this knowing what we want and knowing what we have in us to go about getting what we want that allows our Mars to flow in a positive and harmless way. and allows it to become the energy of our self-actualization, the fuel in the tank of our becoming. And it takes us towards who we really are. And our desire energy, which is the energy of Mars, can tune us into what we truly want to become, who we truly are. And to that extent, it draws us away from the thuggish, willful energy of fight and flight and survival, into a much more refined energy that is decisive and clear in knowing our goals and being able to drive ourselves forward in a way that is useful.
I think with Mars, what I think of is being in our strength. And the word, the actual proper meaning of the word meek being to have a sheath stored so that you're standing in a powerful position because you know your strength, but your sword is sheathed. And I think that to me is the epitome of the Mars energy at its best, is knowing your strength. Because if we don't know our strength, that is when we are most likely to get the sword out and use it unwisely.
Mm-hmm. I also think that a refined view of Mars is, rather than willfulness, it's the willingness to do what we must to become ourselves, which has got a different gesture to it than just blind willfulness of I will get myself on the map.
Because I think that is coming from a position of weakness, the need to prove oneself. If you have the need to prove yourself, then it means that you don't know your worth. So we're back to needing to be in your strength, having that sense of strength and purpose. You know, the talking about being willful, you don't need to be willful if you have a sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is a very valuable journey to go from that weak defensive Mars to that position of strength and knowing. So what about Saturn?
Well, Saturn is all that energy hitting the bricks in a way, isn't it? So we've got I will hitting thou shalt not. You know, Saturn is that at one register, that external authority figure, that denying father, that is just like slamming the brakes on whatever we desire. So the Mars Saturn midpoint is a bit like, you know, the energy of willing hitting the bricks of limitation. And Saturn is that energy of the perimeter fence around our sense of reality, isn't it? This is the way it is. I can go this far and no further. So I think we often really experience it as denial, limitation, frustration, obstruction. And how can we tune into the positive aspect of Saturn? And I think this is very largely through self-responsibility. You know, none of us, I expect, have received the kind of rubber stamping we really desired from our authority figures that might have felt validating or whatever, or truly enabling. And I think at bottom, Saturn, in its most positive aspect, is the enabler. This is what creates the structures and the flow, the channels through which energy can flow when we have made our commitment. And when we take responsibility for the conditions that exist in our lives, and the conditions that exist externally in our lives will always reflect inner conditions that we, fortunately, as astrologers, can see in the birth chart and therefore unpick a bit. So when we can understand that what we're experiencing as circumstances, frustrating though they may be, is actually a picture of inner conditions, and it can guide us. And Saturn is there to enable and empower once we have decided what we are committed to. And then you see the value of Mars and Saturn coming together, that if I have decided what I want, Saturn will enable me to find the channels and the structures by which I can bring that into being, and those together create the power of decision. And there's something magical about that power when we really land in that sense of what we truly want for the highest good of all, not just our self-will, but for the highest good of life. I think Saturn becomes extremely empowering.
Listening to you talking about the two and thinking about the midpoint between the two, it's made me think about Saturn in Aries, particularly, when you were talking about, hitting that brick wall, I think that's a classic feeling of Saturn in Aries, where the will is constantly thwarted and the individual is left feeling a sense of true disempowerment and discouragement, actually. And then thinking about Mars in Capricorn, but Mars in Capricorn is exalted, or Saturn in Aries is in his fall.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not entirely sure what I make of that, because it's only just occurred to me at this moment listening to you. But what we have here then is this need for the two to come to a mutual respect of each other.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing about that exaltation of Saturn of Mars in Capricorn is that it's in Capricorn that it is willing to take responsibility, and it's kind of has that Capricorn gesture of kneeling to a higher power. Aries doesn't have of itself any sense of anything outside itself. Unmitigated, it's brutish. But when we have the context of Capricorn, that's where higher power is kind of, it's seen and has to be observed and has to be honored. And then Mars comes into its own.
Well, I love what you're doing, and it's a beautiful clarification of these two energies. Your talk, of course, explores this intergenerational trauma aspect of this midpoint. So I think we could all look forward to that. And I'll be putting a link to the Astrological Lodge of London in the description box, so that people can book ahead for this talk. So just a reminder to everyone that the talk is on the 14th of October at 7:15. Now, everyone, you are thinking, oh, that's a good month away. And you know what will happen? You'll forget. So if you're interested, go ahead and book now while you remember. This is one that is not to be missed. Kate.
And I really hope to be able to draw out in that talk, looking at these charts and how they interact, a tangible sense of how we interact across time with our ancestral families as soulful collaborators in resolving dilemmas which the family as a wider unit of being take on as their work together.
Yes, well, this is a source of tremendous fascination for me. It crops up in my work time and again. So I really appreciate what you are doing. Besides your talk for the Astrological Lodge in October, how might people learn about your work?
They can look on my website, arwenastrology.wordpress.com.
Well, I will also be putting a link to that in the description box, along with the link to your book and to the interviews that we have already done together.
Yeah, lovely.
So thank you once again, Kate, for your time today.
You're so welcome, Anna. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be talking some more about Saturn. Until then, goodbye.